Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next masterclass. Thank you for joining, and I'm very, very excited this week to bring you someone who has built an incredible tool that impacts not only artists, but also the industry as a whole. You know, if I think about what these guys do, they improve that kind of final quality of your end product, which for us at Unheard is something we think about a lot because as a promotional tool, what we see so often is artists trying to promote their music when actually they're not ready to. You know, and this isn't us saying you aren't good at songwriting or anything like that. This is us saying you haven't finished the product properly. And we see this all the time. And so what we actively encourage artists to do is sit in that preparatory phase for longer, you know, making sure that your digital health is good, your final product is good, you know, your track's been mixed and mastered. And then ultimately your promotion and the impact of your promotion is far greater. And so I'm really excited to have Simon on the call from Masterchannel, one of the co-founders of Masterchannel, and the guy that built the thing. You know, so this is the guy that knows the technology inside out. And not only kind of is Simon technical and is the product a very technical product, but they've done great on the commercial side in the sense that if you look at who these guys have partnered with, it's pretty much every single distributor or the big distributors in the world. You know, and this has all happened over a short space of time with a really like lean team. So I'm in awe of what these guys have done. I think it's super impressive over such a short space of time. And so I'm really excited to welcome you, Simon, to share a little bit about your story and what you guys have done at Masterchannel.
Thanks, Alex. I'm flattered. Same goes for you guys. It's great to be partnering up with you, not only today, but in general. I think, you know, we serve similar needs or the same audience, to say the least. And yeah. I'm just going to share my screen and we can jump right in. Let's see.
Great. And what we'll do as well, Simon, I'll just mention is if anyone has any questions, so Simon's going to present for 30 minutes or so. If anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat or the Q&A and we'll get to those questions afterwards. You know, and I think there could potentially be lots of questions around how this works and how best to approach mixing and mastering and, you know, those sorts of things. So I'll pause there, hand it over to you, Simon, but any questions, pop them in the chat and we will get to them at the end.
Sounds great. All right. Then here we go. So yeah, as Alex already said, I'm here to shed a little bit of light on the whole mastering process. What is mastering? You know, what is engineering, what goes into it, why it is important, so on and so forth. And I hope that after today, you have a little bit of a better idea how you can use mastering as one of the tools in your toolbox to optimize your chances for success when you release music, when you produce music, essentially throughout your whole life cycle as an artist. That's my goal today. So we'll go over what mastering is in the first place, you know, formal definitions, where it came from. Then we're going to talk about why it is actually important and why you should pay attention to that whole topic and not just write it off as a black box process, as many do. Then how you can actually benefit the most from that process by preparing your music, your mixes in the best way possible. And then we're going to talk about how technology has allowed us to build AI systems that do this very, very well and very cost effectively, which is especially interested if you're an artist starting out, or if you want to learn more about the mastering process and you don't necessarily have the big bucks yet to go to a big mastering studio. And as Alex said, if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat and we'll also have plenty of time at the end to answer any questions that might come up. But maybe just really quickly in the beginning, who am I and what qualifies me to talk about this topic? So maybe most importantly, I've worked as a freelance mastering engineer for 9 years now. I've worked for top 50 artists in the world. I did everything from hip hop to jazzy stuff to German Schlager. So I've seen it all, I've done it all. And it's still a big passion of mine. It's also very important to me because it connects me to the artistic community. Because I'm also one of the co-founders of Masterchannel, an AI mastering service, and that job can get very technical. So for me, it's always very important to stay in touch with artists, to listen to what they have to say, understand their language, and make sure that what we're building is actually relevant in any way. And the reason I'm able to build these things is because I have a background in computer science and I worked in audio research. So I've always been super keen on the intersection of technology and audio, and mastering was the first step, and now Masterchannel is the second big step for me. So let's talk about what mastering actually is. if we look at the Mastering Bible by Bob Katz, we can read that mastering is considered the last greatest step in the audio production process, and it's supposed to bridge the whole music production process, including mixing and the outside world. So when you think about mastering is typically when you've done your recording, you've done your mixing, you're happy with your arrangement, and now it's time to think about, okay, I want to release this at some point. Is it good enough? Does it meet all the criteria for release? This is where mastering comes in, right? And no matter if you use AI mastering or an engineer, the goal is that after mastering, you know that your music is good enough and can compete with everything else that's out there. That's the definition of mastering. And that makes it a very technical process and sometimes hard to grasp process. And that's where we're going to disentangle the whole topic a little bit today. Now, why should you master? As I mentioned earlier, this is often a step that is written off as a black box process or something that can be done with a preset or a plugin. But it can be actually so much more than that if you actually pay enough attention and if you really try to incorporate it into your workflow. And I think before we get into the technical details, it's maybe important to also think about the more abstract or emotional aspects to this, right? If you go through a good mastering process, you will know that your music is going to be ready for the world at the end of the day. If, for example, you try to promote it through Spotify and you want to get into a playlist and your music sounds as good as all the other music that's already out there, you will have no problem getting into those playlists. But if your music maybe sounds a little bit off, and even if the playlist curator is not necessarily a technical person, they will notice that something about it just isn't right, doesn't sit right, doesn't really fit into the mix of other songs that are in the playlist. And you might have a hard time getting there. So that's one important aspect of mastering. Next one is that you not only want to blend in, but you also want specifics about your music to be enhanced, to stand out, right? You want to make sure that the sonic qualities of your track support all the musical aspects. For example, if you have a sax solo, in the bridge or whatever, I don't know, then you want that to stand out because it's something that makes your track unique. And bad engineering can really do harm to those individual aspects, which then make it much harder for listeners to pick up on them, especially if they listen to them in a playlist, for example. And then lastly, and I think this is also a very important aspect, it's the peace of mind, the confidence that after mastering, your music is actually ready to be released, and you no longer have to overthink and question if this is going to sound great, if it's played on the radio, if you played in the club, if you add it to a playlist somewhere. You know that you can now check off that final box of quality assurance, and you know this is the song the best it can be, and I'm going to run with it. And believe it or not, this is actually, I think, one of the most important pieces of feedback we get from our users, that they now finally feel like, I was going back and forth the whole time, and now I've done the mastering process, and now I feel much better about proceeding with next steps. For example, through Unheard, to get your audience going and all those things. So overall, mastering is very important to increase your chances of success, no questions asked. And I've seen this also as a mastering engineer myself. Many artists that I worked with for many years, they went from veteran producer to big international acts. They've all experienced the same thing, and they couldn't do without their pipeline and the mastering part anymore. Now, one important distinction is obviously that this process looks different for, let's call them professionals, or people that have left their mark in the industry and they maybe have a great cash flow and they're established artists, and artists that are still starting out, right? If we look at mastering or the engineering problem in general for very established artists, quite often if they've produced music and it comes out of a good environment, only skilled engineers were working on it, and they distribute it, it's going to sound great everywhere, right? It's going to sound great on a hi-fi system. It's going to sound great on AirPods. It's going to sound great on over-ears, and it's going to sound great live. So the gap that mastering has to bridge for these artists is usually much smaller because everyone involved has so much skill, so much equipment, so much capital that the final touch in mastering is really just very nuanced. Whereas for most of the artists in the world today, and independent artists in particular, it doesn't really look like that, right? Most of the work is done on a computer. Most of it is probably also done on headphones or in environments where you don't have a proper studio with acoustic treatment. So what ends up happening is that you typically optimize for one type of playback scenario, right? So most people are usually concerned about what it sounds like on AirPods, for example, but they might not strike gold with expensive systems. And what happens quite often is that they're super happy in their environment, right? Like they work on their music and their mix for, I don't know, weeks. They listen to it on their setup and they're super happy with how it sounds. And then they step outside and, I don't know, go to the next club venue, play it back, and suddenly that whole world comes crashing down because they realize that nothing sounds right. Everything is all over the place. People can't even really tell what the song is because it's drowned in bass waves and low frequency rumble and those type of things. So I would argue that especially for the long tail of artists, for all these emerging producers that we see today, mastering has gotten so much more important. Now, the question is then, okay, what does actually technically happen, right? I think we're on the same page that mastering can be very important for you as an artist. What actually happens when you consult a mastering engineer, when you use a service like Masterchannel? What are the, like hard criteria that we try to optimize for? And the first thing is, delivery formats. It's a very simple one. You want to make sure that you deliver in the best possible quality to all the streaming services, the DSPs, to make sure that you don't compromise on that end, right? You want to give them full flexibility with what they do afterwards, if they convert it to different formats and so on and so forth. You want to deliver in the best possible format. You also want to make sure you meet all the technical norms. There's a lot of talk about loudness these days, which I'm happy to go more into if any one of you have any specific questions about that later. But you just need to know, what targets to hit, technically speaking, in terms of frequency response, dynamics, especially, and potentially, which is, kind of in between, also intricacies with file formats that can be very delicate. And that just requires some experience to get right. And then, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, and this is probably the most important reason, technically speaking, for you as an artist, you just want to make sure it sounds great everywhere, right? You want your fans to be able to listen to your music on a Bluetooth speaker when they're having a barbecue, and you want it to sound great, right? And that's, one of the hardest parts of mastering to get right, but also the most important part for you as an artist, so that you can feel confident at the end of the day. Now, musically, you obviously try to strike a balance between solving all these technical issues, but then also supporting what's already there. And this is where mastering can get really tricky, because obviously, as I said, if you've worked weeks on your track, you might be very intrigued how your music sounds. You might be very used to it. You get a certain vibe from the frequency distribution and how everything sounds. And then the mastering engineer has to clean up all that stuff. And they have, on one hand, they have to solve for all these technical issues. And then on the other hand, they have to respect all the decisions you made because they support the vibe of the track, right? So they try to meet expectations of your genre, apart from your expectations, of course. As I said, they want to highlight unique aspects of your music. And that's the balance that a mastering engineer or a mastering AI has to strike to make sure that what comes out of the process is not just, dead and technically correct, but that it also has still that flavor of what makes your music unique. And to illustrate this, I've brought a few examples from two different artists where I would argue they've created similar music, but it went through different engineering pipelines. And I brought these examples so you at home can maybe take a listen and then maybe experience how actually the same setting, more or less, but different engineering can have a very drastic influence on the whole feel of a song. And the first song I brought is Girls Like Us by Zoe Wees. And it was mastered by Zeno in Berlin. And, to me, that's how it should be. I'm a great fan of Zeno's work. It just sounds how you would expect a piano version to sound, right? You don't hear any engineering in the track, in my opinion. It's just her and the piano, as it should be. But then there's a different version or a similar version of a different track of hers called Hold Me Like You Used To, which is also a piano version, pretty much the same setup, this time mastered by Ludwig Meyer. back in the days he was still in Munich. And to me, that's a completely different feel, right? Although it's still piano and voice, it actually sounds very, very different. And to me, it sounds like there's more engineering choices you can actually hear in the track. It sounds, a little bit more like there was some intended roughness or some intended non-polishing, if you will, that influenced how it sounded in the end. So that's very interesting to hear, and I just encourage you, if you go to muso.ai, for example, they list all the credits for different engineers, and over time you can actually get a sense for what type of music goes through which engineer, and then also what's their style, how do songs typically sound when they come out of their process. Very interesting to learn about. Second example I brought is Fall Out Boy. I think most of us probably know this album, American Beauty, American Psycho. This one was mastered by Pete Lehman. I think he's based in LA. I don't know him personally. And this is, to me, this is the Fall Out Boy sound. It's a little bit, has a little bit of dirt in the characteristics. It sounds very, very gritty, very much like you would expect such a record, such a rock record to sound. Whereas on the other hand, their album afterwards, Mania, sounds a lot more like a pop record. And this time it went through Sterling Sound and through Chris Geringer in particular. And to me, that's not surprising that it's came out more as a pop record, because Sterling Sound, they do a lot of pop records these days, right? Especially Chris. He's known for a lot of work he does in the pop domain. And if you listen to that album, yes, it's the same artists. Yes, it's music in the same genre, but it sounds much more like a pop record. And that was probably intentional, because the band wanted to go in that direction, or the label, or whoever made that decision. But it's fascinating how the same band, more or less the same music, can sound so vastly different just because different engineering choices were made. So yeah, that was the main introduction to what the mastering process looks like, why we do mastering, some things you can listen for in different examples. And now we're going to look at, okay, if you're convinced now you want to do mastering, maybe you've never done it, how do you actually do it, right? Like who does it? Where do I do it? How much does it cost? Those common questions. And the typical answer that the industry would give you is obviously a mastering studio. Here we can see Sterling Sound, probably the most prestige mastering studio in the world. And there's professional mastering engineers all day, every day, just doing mastering. So they get finished mixes, they polish them, and they return a master that can then be distributed to streaming platforms and other formats. And these engineers, they typically have very specific genre expertise. So they're known for working in the rock, in the pop, in the hip hop domain. They have, a specific taste or style profile that they're known for. And very importantly, they work in very good listening environments. And this is also an easy way to tell apart engineers that might just be starting out and real professionals, not just based on price, but also if you look at what type of environment do they work in. Because especially with a lot of newcomers in the business and a lot of emerging artists, mastering over the last years has sometimes been degraded to just slapping on a plugin or just using this preset. But the problem is that doesn't really help with any of the objectives that I described earlier, that you want mastering to be a quality assurance step, right? And if you don't have a proper listening environment and the person you send your music to also just sits in a bedroom, they will have different frequencies that they don't hear. They will have different issues with their acoustics. So they can't give you that guarantee that if you play back that song in a club, it's going to sound great. Although that is actually what you want out of the mastering process. So if you work with a mastering engineer, I would, of course, check if their genre expertise matches your music, or if you deliberately, as we saw in the examples, maybe want to go a certain direction with someone who comes from a different genre, but then also look at what environment do they actually work in? Do they have technical expertise? Can they hear what they work on, essentially, right? Because that's super important. And then once you've decided that you want mastering, you can as I said, hire a solo engineer. Quite often, a lot of solo engineers also work for mastering companies. So you have Sterling Sound, for example, you have Metropolis in London. They are the big mastering houses that I can think of right now. And they, often also offer flat rates for, different engineers, or they have specific rates per engineer. And then, of course, these days, which I'm going to talk about as well today, you also have a lot of AI solutions that obviously are not as, niche as any engineer would be, but they can get you quite far, especially with the peace of mind aspect that it's not going to blow people's eardrums in the club. And they can give you a sense for where you stand in your mixing process, how well you prepare your stuff, and how it sounds after mastering. And it helps you get to a competitive level without having to spend enormous amounts of money. So just for reference, if you go to one of the big mastering studios, you can easily spend $300 on a track for a master, which usually doesn't really make sense if you're just starting out as an artist. It really only makes sense if you have proper backing, if you have a cash flow, then you might go with an engineer of choice, establish a long-term relationship. But in the beginning, when you're still finding your path, it's usually much easier to go either with a local engineer who might not have the reputation, but still the know-how and the environment, or you use one of the AI mastering services. So then the next question is, okay, no matter if you use an engineer or if you go for an AI mastering service, how do you make sure that you prepare your mix in the best possible way, and that you don't have to be afraid that in the long run, you're scared that, the master didn't come out as you wished for, and it falls back on you because you didn't prepare your mix correctly. And the advice I usually give the artists I work with is that they should think of the mastering stage as a dentist appointment. Sounds very unsexy, but I think it's a good way to think about it, because when you go to a dentist, you also, have a certain mindset or certain expectations, and you also prepare yourself a little. So the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that your mix is as error-free as possible. The same way a dentist will have a hard time fixing you not brushing your teeth, it's the same goes for mastering, right? If there are obvious flaws that you can hear in your mix, it's a bit naive to assume that an engineer will fix them in the best possible way. The best way to fix those things is always at the source. So if you already hear something that you're not happy with, try to fix it yourself first. And if you then realize this is so advanced, I can't fix this myself, then you might consult an engineer. But if you already know what you're sending is compromised, you might want to take a step back and fix that first. The next thing, which is kind of the opposite, is you don't want to do what only the dentist would do, right? You don't want to drill your own teeth, and the same thing goes for mastering. If you are focused on your mix and you think you're great at mixing, don't try to compromise that process with things that only apply in mastering, right? Don't crank up the volume in your mix because you want your master to sound loud, because that's the job of a mastering engineer. Don't obsess too much with frequency response and all these technical aspects if it doesn't serve your music, right? All those things is something that should be thought of in the mastering stage. And you can quite easily ruin your whole mixing process if you're only looking at the horizon of mastering and then, trying to work backwards. That usually doesn't work really well. So the same as with the dentist, if you follow these rules, what usually happens is you get a clean polish and a good to go, right? That's the best possible outcome. And the same goes for your music. You send in your music, it comes back better sounding, but it still sounds like your music, and you get the good to go from the engineer or from the service that says now it's ready for release, right? That's the best possible outcome. One thing that is also important that happens every once in a while, which contradicts a bit what I said earlier, but where you have to strike a balance, is the feedback aspect, right? Because depending on which engineer you choose or which service you choose, you will obviously receive feedback on your music as well. So it could be that if you choose an engineer, I don't know, who's worked with jazz music and you send them a hip hop track, they will come back and say that you should dial down your kick, or that the 808 is way too overpowering. And then it's back to you to decide how much of this contributes to the musical aspects and how much of this do I want fixed in mastering. But you should at least listen to the feedback that comes back. What we notice, for example, at Masterchannel quite often is that people as I mentioned multiple times now, they've worked for sometimes even months on that track, and they're very used to their sound, and they don't realize that in their apartment or with their speakers, they don't really have a great low end response, so there's way too much low end rumble. And if you were to play that back in the club, the club would probably throw you out. So they then use Masterchannel, and we give visual feedback on how you can improve your mix. And then we clearly show that after mastering, we fixed all these low-end rumble issues, and that there was a lot of low-end rumble in the beginning. And quite often what people don't take away from that is that maybe they should pay attention to that more and try to get better at mixing to prevent these issues in the first place. But what they often do instead is they blame the mastering service and say, oh, why did you remove all that low end, right? And that's where you have to establish like this feeling for mastering. And that's why I also said it's so good to get into that process early with different services and different engineers to get a feeling for where do I stand in my journey as, a producer or part-time mixer engineer, and how much am I missing to get to a point where I can be really confident in what I'm doing. And that's where specifically AI mastering can be very helpful. So yeah, that's the right mindset to think about mastering. For you as a producer at home, what does that mean in concrete audio terms before you upload something to a service or send something to an engineer? Obviously, you want to export things lossless. We still have a lot of people that upload MP3 files. That's not ideal because it doesn't contain all the hidden information that an engineer might have to work with. So you want to make sure that you export in the best possible resolution that you recorded in. If you recorded in 44 kilohertz, export in 44 kilohertz. At least choose 24 bits or better. Then the mastering system has enough meat to work with. As I said earlier, don't do what only the dentist would do. Don't crank up the limiters. Don't try to just hammer the compressor to make things louder. Leave that up to the mastering stage. It will make you a much better producer, and it will make for a much better outcome. And the same goes for all kinds of effects that I often hear about, especially when it comes to stereo widening and 3D sound and those type of things. Usually that's a wow effect that you notice once you put it on, but the longer you listen to it, the more problematic it becomes in a lot of different ways, especially when it comes to all these technical norms and where the track is going to be played back. If this was all too fast for you, we also prepared a guide. If you just follow that link, where we list all these criteria and also have screenshots in your DAW, how you can best prepare your mix and make sure that the export settings are correct before you go off to mastering. I'm just going to check real quick if there are any questions at this point. Questions are loading. No questions so far.
No questions yet.
Sweet. I'll just move on. So then let's get to the topic of AI mastering, which, obviously I'm biased, but personally I think is very, very interesting. The challenges that now are introduced in AI mastering are obviously, how do you make an AI pick up on nuances that an engineer would pick up on? How can an AI be as meticulous, as trained to pick up certain details in a track? How do you apply adjustments in a way that, they sound natural and they don't sound artificial and they are similar to what an engineer would do? How do you make sure that you just, don't build a system that was trained on copyrighted material, just stealing it from the internet, or just stealing stuff that people upload to the service? And how do you actually understand what happened, right? As I mentioned earlier, one big aspect of mastering is that you want to come out of that process with confidence and with peace of mind that your music is now ready to be played back anywhere. If you don't really understand what the system did, or the builders of the system don't really know what the system does, it's a hit or miss situation. You could trust the system and be lucky, or you can trust the system and be disappointed. And none of that is ideal. So if we look at how AI mastering has traditionally been built with a lot of our competitors, which have been around for years, typically the approach was, the easiest one to think of, which is we're just going to take some amateur mixes, run them through an engineer, and then try to train a system that, maps between these two. So if you give it an amateur mix, it's going to return a professional master. The problem with that approach is, first of all, it's very hard to get data that represents all kinds of genres, that keeps up with different trends that pop up, there's styles in music, they come and go, and listening preferences change. Even devices we listen on change. So it's very hard to build a system that is up to speed on those type of things. You lack the data to make it very diverse. And one big problem, as I mentioned before, is that you don't really know what's going on if it just finds some matching algorithm, right? You know that for the examples that you fed the model with, it's going to do a great job, but there's never 100% confidence that for new material that it hasn't listened to before, it's able to produce the same output. And that's why AI mastering so far, or before the recent advancements in AI, was always a hit or miss situation. It almost sounded like, if you fit the preset, it's going to sound great, but if you fall outside of what the model was trained on, it's not really going to work. And that's why AI mastering has had a very, bad reputation, honestly, because it just didn't deliver what it promised, which mastering promises, which is peace of mind. So when we approached the process, we realized we have to find a different way to make this happen. And instead of blindly just feeding a model, data and then hoping that the model figures something out, we thought, why don't we prime the model with more intelligence, right? Why don't we talk to all the engineers out there, find out what they listen for in a mix, find out what they optimize towards, and then try to prime the system to listen for those things in the mix, right? So one thing could be that the system listens for very common EQ problems that happen in the low end. And it identifies that in a mix that you upload has that problem, and that a master that comes out of the system doesn't have that. Another thing might be, dynamic balance throughout the track, that you don't want the track to fluctuate too much in dynamics because that'll be too tedious for the listener to listen to. And the last thing might be that, you want the vocals to sit on top for certain tracks, those type of things. And what we did is we talked to all these engineers, we understood how they listen to these things, and then we encoded them mathematically to not let the system just look at anything and everything that it finds in the mix and randomly start optimizing or matching stuff, but instead listen to those specific things that an engineer also listens to, and that the system can assess, that the system can assess where's the mix at and where do I need to optimize things. And the beauty of that system is that we can now implement an AI model that we know understands what's wrong with the mix and where it lacks certain criteria, and it can produce a master where it can then verify, okay, now these criteria are fulfilled, right? So it's a transparent system where we know what is going on, we know why the system makes certain decisions, and we now have peace of mind that the system actually does what it promises, and that users can have peace of mind at the end of the day that what comes out is actually better than what they put in. So what does that mean for you as an artist? Well, thanks to services like us, you now have that peace of mind and you can bridge that gap that otherwise, only a very skilled engineer would be able to cross. You can produce in your favorite environment. You don't have to go through expensive engineering. And you can use AI mastering to then make sure that it sounds great everywhere, no matter if it's, on your dad's hi-fi system or somewhere in a club. The other cool thing that we're able to do with Masterchannel is that we're able to not only cater to the knowledge of all the different engineers that we've spoken to, but we can also make it very specific, right? So in this example, what you see here is our normal website where you can upload any genre, any style, and the system will understand what you uploaded. And it will, fix all the issues that we talked about in a very neutral way that, any engineer could approve regardless of what genre they come from. But if you really want a specific flavor, going back to, these different criteria, we worked with a Grammy-winning engineer to actually specifically find out about his intricacies in his process, what he specifically listens to, and we build a system that picks up on those things and delivers masters that are more specific to the masters he would, more similar to the masters he would produce as an engineer. And that's the beauty of our system, that we can incorporate these details while still maintaining that quality assurance level. And that's West Clark AI, which we launched a year ago. So that is more or less all I have to share today. All Unheard users actually get 20% off Masterchannel if you use the code Unheard20. So if you're interested, you can try the service completely for free. You can upload as many tracks as you want. You can listen to the full track. But if you want to use it for distribution, you have to pay. And that's where maybe the coupon code comes in handy for 20% off both our normal mastering, which is very neutral, works great for any genre, and then Wes Clark, which works specifically for more pop-oriented genres. So with that being said, happy mastering, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was great. I certainly learned a lot. And actually, throughout that presentation, there is a question, so I'll jump onto that question in a second. But throughout the presentation, I think you answered a lot of my questions, which were around, the quality of the final master. Because and we get this question all the time. What's the quality of the final master from Masterchannel versus going to a real, engineer? And I think you covered that really thoroughly, and it's great to hear that reassurance. I certainly feel reassured now that Masterchannel is the place to go, for a high quality mix, and it's even affordable, which I think is a great mission.
Yeah, I think if you really, if you've saved up those bucks, go to your engineer of choice. But there's a long way in between where you can optimize your mix, where you can release a bunch of stuff, get more experience in the process, and you can, fix all the technical issues with an AI just as well. But if you want that extra mojo, those last, 2%, then obviously go with an engineer.
Yeah, love that. And then there's a question from Matthew Davis. Hi, Matthew. Good to hear from you. Which is, can you explain some more about the Masterchannel algorithm? How did you train it without using music? What is happening behind the UI? And is it always the same order of processes?
Great question. So maybe I'll answer the second question first. It's never the same process. It's actually 100% individual for each track. So no two tracks are treated the same. Because as I said, we don't use presets, or we don't use a mix and match algorithm where we compare something, that the model saw before, and then it's just going to apply the same thing. So it's truly individual every time. How do I best explain the algorithm? Well, because it's AI, it's not necessarily an algorithm, but let's call it a framework that we set up, right? So if you think back to the different criteria that I mentioned that we primed the system on, you essentially have to imagine that behind the UI, there's a mastering engineer, and then there's a judge, right? And the mastering engineer comes up with something that it thinks sounds good. And then the judge says, but you missed this mark, and that criteria is not good enough. That criterion is not good enough. And these criteria could use optimization. Feeds that feedback back to the mastering engineer. System tries again, comes up with something until it understands, oh, this is the direction I'm supposed to go in. Now everybody's satisfied. And that's essentially how the system works. And that's also why we didn't need a lot of training data. We just needed a bunch of criteria from different engineers. And then with just, sometimes tracks we produce on our own, just letting the system work on those, it already developed an understanding for where do I have to turn, which knob do I have to turn. So maybe it's similar to, if you've ever attended a session with an engineer and you sit on the couch in the back and they, tweak a knob and then go a little bit back until they find a balance. That's essentially pretty much what's happening behind the UI, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Thank you. Amazing. Any other questions from anyone? We'll just hold for a minute or so. And Simon, one question I had is, in terms of typically the artists that you see using the platform, would you say that those are, in the long tail of artists, more developing artists, or are you also seeing artists who are much further along in their career but are independent, and resourceful, also using the platform?
Absolutely. So we've had some of the biggest producers in the world use us. They typically don't necessarily use us for the final release because they have access to the best of the best, but they would use us all the way up to that final step because they want to ensure that their mix is as good as it can be before they send it off. And we have a lot of independent artists that are professional full-time artists that also use this for releases. We try to keep up with that, and we have a playlist on Spotify that we update every once in a while. But yeah, at this point we master more than 50,000 tracks every month. So it's a tough task for us to really know where people are coming from.
Oh, that's incredible. 50,000 a month. I mean, that speaks to the volume of tracks being released, as a whole, doesn't it? 125,000 a day. So you guys are making some great progress. I guess from a business perspective, What have been the key acquisition channels for you, to bring in more artists to the platform?
Honestly, it's been a lot of talking about the service, going into communities where people produce a lot of music, working with distributors, because that's usually when people get that FOMO or that fear of, oh, if I press this button, this is the song. This is going to be the file that's going to be shared with everyone. That's usually a great point to ask people, are you 100% sure this is good enough? And then they can run it for free. And if they still then feel safe that, yeah, I don't really hear the difference, or, the visual feedback that I get gives me a thumbs up, I'm good to go, I'm not paying anything. But, quite often, as I said, especially if you've worked weeks on one track, you're blindfolded by your own work in a way. That's when people really have eye-opening experiences. And then quite often we see people, suddenly mastering their entire album, and they text us and say, well, I'm happy I did this, because I wasn't really aware, how much trouble that would have cost down the line.
Brilliant. I love that. And then there are two additional questions. So Michael Schrader has asked, my speciality is masters for backing tracks on stage. I've already had many songs mastered for live and would now like to switch to Masterchannel. So new customer. Are there plans to be able to upload reference tracks to adapt the style for new songs?
Right. So currently we don't, it's something we have on our to-do list is reference tracks. We currently don't support that, but what you will notice if you upload different versions of your music, that the system will pick up on that. So it will realize that, I don't know, first version of your song, I don't know, sounded darker, or maybe the drums were quieter, and then you upload a new track with louder drums. The system will pick up on that and realize, oh, maybe it's the drums that you were not happy with. So the key to working with Masterchannel is really just bombarding the service with tracks, more or less, until you understand, oh, this is how this system works. Similar to how you would work, with an engineer of choice, that you have a relationship with a back and forth communication channel. That's ideally how we'd use Masterchannel. But +1 on the reference tracks, I hope we get to implement that at some point.
Love that. And then another question, which was similar to Michael's, but an additional part was, do you have plans to be able to facilitate mastering of a whole album at once?
So right now, unfortunately, you have to do it in separate tabs. But especially if you use the neutral mastering system, you will get a very consistent result, because, as I said, it focuses mainly on technical aspects. So it's not going to, make your whole balance of tracks go wild. And we have plenty of people using it that way. That being said, stay tuned. There's some updates coming in the next weeks, where we will most likely, maybe we won't call it album mastering, but we will support a feature that allows for uploading multiple tracks at once.
Nice. Thank you so much, Simon. You're a busy man, and when you're talking about new updates coming, I know this is you doing it. So congratulations on all the progress, and we won't keep you any longer. But I learned so much actually there. So thank you, and I hope that was useful for everyone who joined. And what we'll do as well is we'll share this with all of our community in our newsletter. And we'll also pop it onto YouTube for those that generally are interested in the music space. So hopefully this is useful for those people too. So thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks for having me, Alex.
Thanks, Simon. Speak soon. Take care. Thanks, guys.